Cold War Video Notes Part 5. So moving on, we now have President Johnson. There's a lovely picture of President Johnson. And a lot of people, the one thing that they associate with Johnson is going to be Vietnam. Vietnam, yes, Vietnam. As far as American history goes, Johnson kind of has the bad rap because he was the president during one of the turning points of the Vietnam War. He is going to send the most troops over. There is a big troop surge whenever Johnson is president, and you can see the picture there on the right hand side. It's going to be something that kind of plagues Johnson's presidency. Just to take time out for a little bit of U.S. history, he is of course going to be the president that takes over after Kennedy because of the assassination. He will go on to actually pass the Civil Rights Amendments that Kennedy was wanting to implement and pass as again a way in 1964 to kind of commemorate Kennedy's wishes. So he's going to have that under his belt as far as domestic policy. But when we start talking about foreign policy, again we get into Vietnam War and something very specific called the Tet Offensive. So the Tet Offensive was a 2-day ceasefire agreement for January 30th, because essentially that's the New Year's holiday for Vietnam, and both sides agreed that they would, let the New Year, the holiday be observed, and the communists go back on the agreement. They attack, and it is very destructive for the American forces. Something else that I like to talk a little bit about is something called the Johnson treatment. I think the top of your screen there might actually be cut off. The Johnson treatment that President Lyndon B. Johnson is very famous for. You can kind of see there how close he is to that other man. He was a very forceful man. He liked to get his way. He liked to get his wishes, and basically the way he would do that would be not only through political maneuvers, but just very physical persuasion. Johnson would get up in the face of the people opposing him or anybody that wasn't giving him his way. And this is known as the Johnson treatment. He was very, like we said, very forceful and had no problems getting in people's face in order to get them to finally back down. I mean, you can see this poor one man is, backing up against the desk. There's nowhere for him to go, and he's still trying to get away from Johnson because Johnson was a very in-your-face kind of guy until you basically agreed what he wanted with what he wanted you to do. Please take a moment to check this cartoon out. Push pause if need be, just to try and get the general message. Here is a picture of Vietnam, North Vietnam, what's going on. And again, now would be a good time to refresh your memory. Which parallel was North Vietnam, South Vietnam? Which parallel line splits the two? And then just another quick check to make sure that you know which one is Korea and which line was the Korean split between North and South Korea that we talked about in previous videos. And just a moment to kind of take a bit of a time out and show you some pictures. These are ones that I've kind of cultivated from contemporary history classes and American history classes. If you ever get a chance to take contemporary history with Coach Tremont, he does a very good job of going through all of this. He's actually been to Vietnam and has got some pictures of going into some of the tunnels and mazes underneath Vietnam. If you ask me about the tunnels and mazes in the warfare of Vietnam after we take the AP exam, ask me to get out the PowerPoint that shows you some of those pictures of the underground tunnels. Moving on to Nixon. Nixon's going to be famous for, as far as our class, detente, this relaxation of tensions that kind of helps end Vietnam. Nixon is going to be a powerhouse in the foreign policy region, and coming off of Johnson presidency, that was kind of a big deal. Someone who was willing to talk to some of the other folks and not be a bit of a bully, a bit of that aggressive, in-your-face type of foreign policy. And Nixon's going to be one of the first presidents in quite a while to actually visit China. He's also going to visit the USSR. He's going to be involved in the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Those are the ones where they're starting to back off and limit the amount of weapons. We start off just saying we aren't going to make any more, and then SALT 2 is going to come along, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to start taking them apart. Again, the idea of detente, the backing off of the relaxation of the tensions, where of course brinkmanship in the previous unit, the previous section, was the threat of the force and mutual assured destruction. Nixon, as you saw in the brinkmanship, or if you're going to see in the detente video, I think it's going to see in the detente video, I'll send you a link here in just a moment, is he's famous for ping-pong diplomacy. It was kind of the excuse, ping-pong was, the excuse to go over and kind of open up those new relations, so they literally, and no joke, set up ping-pong tournaments and used that as a way to, again, reach out and try to speak to those communist nations again. So after you've had a fight with a parent, a friend, a loved one, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, if you go and you do something that's totally innocuous, it's just something that you always used to do, well, whatever, and it's again a way to break the ice, to ease that tension, or a way to kind of set up lines of communication again, well, you've just basically done ping pong diplomacy. You just didn't know it. So again, his foreign policy is very well regarded. After all of this, detente, visiting China, ping-pong diplomacy, helping to ease the tensions, all of that seems to be clouded over by Watergate. Sort of like Johnson, the stuff that he did as far as civil rights and everything else that he did for the country. It is all overshadowed by Vietnam. Well, with Nixon, it's all overshadowed by Watergate, and that is, of course, the scandal that eventually is traced all the way back to the presidency that forces him to resign, Nixon to resign, where he was meddling in the elections. That is also something that after the test I'd like to spend some time with you on, since we've got a little bit. I want to kind of show you the elections, talk about Watergate, talk about how the folks got caught, and basically give you the whole background to that story. It takes me about half a period to do that, maybe 45 minutes. So again, remind me after the test. Here is Nixon shaking Mao's hand. Mao, of course, in China, Mao Zedong. Here's the Watergate Hotel. You can actually go stay there. And again, if you've seen Forrest Gump, then you're hopefully making the connection here. Alright, and here is Nixon actually resigning the presidency. And unfortunately, the guy who takes over, Gerald Ford, his presidency is marred by the idea that he had to actually pardon Nixon. We couldn't actually have a president become a criminal. That would be more disastrous to the international and the reputation of the United States than just letting that flow through. So he, and again, there's debates on that as well that we aren't going to get into, but the pardoning of Nixon is his responsibility. He gets that privilege, that luxury, if you will. And of course, it's going to mar his presidency. He isn't going to be reelected. But he continues thawing out the Cold War with SALT II. He is unfortunately, though, in office when Saigon falls, and that's when finally there is no more South Vietnam, when the Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh's forces take over the last vestiges of control in Vietnam. He's also president during the OPEC oil boycott, which is going to cause lots of inflation for gas. OPEC is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. It started up in 1960, so that's back with Kennedy. And more countries will join, but the ones who started off are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. Other nations are going to join later, but essentially they're going to start to withhold oil, and it's going to cause lots of problems, lots of high prices of gas over here in the United States. So let's switch our attention over to Cuba. We kind of sort of talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I never really talked about how Fidel Castro takes over and what's going on there. Cuba wins its independence from Spain in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, but the United States kind of maintains control as a little it's their little the United States' little protectorate. The Platt Amendment provides for U.S. bases in Cuba, like Guantanamo Bay, and there's going to be a U.S.-supported government, the Batista dictatorship that is going to run Cuba for the time being. But there's a Cuban Revolution in 1956, and Fidel Castro is going to take over. And this is where I usually talk about oh, no, not on the picture yet. This is where I usually talk about a little bit about the revolution. Again, Batista's in charge. It's a United States puppet government, or at least highly influenced government by the United States, and Fidel Castro is a huge military figure. He's also got the help of a guy named Che Guevara, who's going to rally the peasants in this grassroots movement to take Cuba back from the Batista government. They're going to use guerrilla warfare to accomplish all of this. Again, special note, the U.S. controlled Cuba's sugar production, their banking, their transportation, their tourism, and their public utilities. So again, there's no doubt here that there's a heavy hand on Cuban politics by the United States. And again, Che Guevara and the other folks, the peasants and Castro, are going to be very resentful of this. So again, economic imperialism from our imperialism chart kind of rears its head here again, so remind yourself, refresh your memory on that. And as the starred information says, many revolutions today are more about economic independence than political. It's not so much anymore about democracy and freedom as it is who's going to run the country, make the money, who's going to control the money, and who's going to benefit. And this goes all the way, we can see this especially in our recent future. Kuwait, does Saddam have the right to invade the country? No, of course not. But if you get down to the heart of the matter, if he's running things and if Saddam Hussein in the 90s was running the oil in Kuwait, then it was going to cause problems for the United States. So again, economic independence more so than political. So Fidel Castro is going to establish this dictatorship. He starts off as a promoter of democracy, but it becomes very clear that's not really going to be what kind of government he's going to institute. He takes power, seizes industry, imposes economic embargo, or the United States is going to actually impose an economic embargo on Castro because he's getting more friendly with the Soviet Union. Castro visits Kennedy, he visits Eisenhower. It's a very icy reception, and finally Kennedy enacts the embargo. The night before he puts the order through, he buys a big old box and a big set of Cuban cigars, and has limited our ability to trade with Cuba ever since Kennedy's administration. So every once in a while there's talk. Just last year there was talk about, hey, should we lift the embargo to Cuba? But nothing really has come of that. So we saw earlier with the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy that that invasion failed. It was misinformation by the FBI. It embarrasses Kennedy. He can't be seen as soft on communism. It happens at the beginning of his term as president, because the elections were in 1960. 1961 is when he takes over, and 1961 is when the Bay of Pigs happens. Then we've got spy planes that are going to detect the Cuban missiles, and we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis from previous videos. And again, we get into the whole idea of removing missiles. Hopefully you took a moment to look at the Brinkmanship cartoon, Brinkmanship video. That does an excellent job of explaining what's going on with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It talked about, just as a refresher, as a reminder of a previous video, it talked about the telegram that comes through that's from Khrushchev, but then another one comes through and you can tell that it's not necessarily Khrushchev. Khrushchev is trying to undo what's been done. He's trying to be reasonable. Then the next telegram comes in the next day from the hardliners, old Stalinist supporters, and essentially the United States accepts the first one, or the second to last one that comes through. So again, the Cuban Missile Crisis is very confusing, but as long as you get the gist of it, as long as you understand that it was almost World War III, that again, it's the definition of brinkmanship, going to the edge of using your weapons and then pulling back at the last minute, someone blinks, then you are set for the test. And the fact that this is going to lead to Khrushchev's downfall. He will be ousted. There will be the folks back home in the USSR that will then manipulate to get him out of office. Today, Cuba's in the economic crisis since the fall of the Soviet Union. Oh, isn't that sweet? Castro and Khrushchev. So the Cold War is going to finally end. Western European living conditions had vastly improved, where of course the Eastern European living conditions, working conditions, economic conditions were steadily decreasing. So behind the Iron Curtain, there was a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and they are somewhat seeing what's going on in outside nations. And that's where we get into that detente video. Please take a moment to look at that so you can see the softening, the relaxation of tensions. Soviets and the U.S. Agree on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You need to make sure that you have a good idea of when that happens, that it's towards the end, that we're not going to increase our nuclear weapons. Non-proliferation. Proliferation is a word you want to make sure that you understand. Along with the Helsinki Accords, they do a great job talking in that video. Hopefully you caught it on detente about the Helsinki Accords. For our purposes, it's the agreement that no more boundaries are going to be changed by force. So we're not going to go to war to change boundaries. They just are what they are. And it is time for some more checkup questions. Please record your answers in Edmodo.